Blonde hair, blue eyes, a pure-blooded warrior race from the frozen north. This is the Viking we all know. For centuries, this image has been burned into our minds. It's in our movies, our television shows, our video games. It's become historical fact. We've built an entire industry around this image. Viking festivals, Viking tourism, Viking identity. We dress our children up as these mythical warriors. But what if I told you that everything you think you know about Vikings is a lie? What if the real Vikings were genetically diverse, with ancestors from across the globe? What if some of the most famous Vikings weren't even from Scandinavia at all? What if the blonde-haired, blue-eyed warrior was actually the minority, not the majority? And what if the story of a pure Viking race wasn't just a mistake, but a myth they deliberately wanted us to believe? Using groundbreaking science that can read the genetic secrets locked in thousand-year-old bones, we're about to reveal the Viking DNA they tried to erase. But first, we need to understand how this lie began, because the truth is darker than you think, and it starts with a question that will change everything you believe about history. So where did this idea of a pure Viking race actually come from? Here's what they don't teach you in school. It wasn't from the Viking age itself. The myth was born much later, in the 1800s, and it was born from desperation. Europe was in chaos. Revolutions everywhere. Old empires crumbling. New nations struggling to be born. As nations like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Germany scrambled to build strong modern identities, they had a fundamental problem. How do you unite millions of people under one flag? How do you make them believe they're special, chosen, superior to their neighbors? The answer came from intellectuals, historians, and artists who understood something crucial about human psychology. People need heroes. They need to believe their ancestors were great, so they gave them the greatest ancestors they could imagine. The Viking was the perfect candidate. But there was a problem. The real Vikings were too complicated, too diverse, too human. So they simplified them. Artists and writers completely reinvented them as noble, romantic figures, the founders of their nations. They were depicted as uniformly tall, fair, and heroic. This wasn't just art. This was mass production of mythology. Books, operas, paintings, all spreading the same message. This was nation-building through mythology. They needed a simple, powerful, and unified image of the past. The truth was inconvenient. And it worked brilliantly. People bought into the myth completely, but this was just the beginning. Because in the 20th century, this innocent myth would be weaponized in ways that would shock the world, and the consequences would be catastrophic. What happened next should terrify you, and it should make you question everything you've ever been told about history. This idealized myth was hijacked and twisted by the most evil regime in human history. The Nazis took this image of a pure northern warrior and turned it into the foundation of their horrific ideology of Aryan supremacy. Heinrich Himmler, one of the architects of the Holocaust, was obsessed with Viking mythology. He created entire SS units dedicated to studying Nordic history. They stripped the Viking of its actual history and transformed it into a symbol of racial purity. Viking runes became Nazi symbols. Viking mythology became Nazi propaganda. They took a culture that, as we'll see, was incredibly diverse and multicultural, and turned it into a symbol of racial hatred. After the war, you'd think this twisted version would die, but it didn't. Instead, pop culture took over. Hollywood, television, and comic books cemented the stereotype even deeper. Movies like The Vikings in 1958 established the visual language we still use today. The horned helmet, a complete fiction never worn by historical Vikings, became their universal symbol. It was actually invented for Wagner's operas in the 1800s. From Thor to Vikings to countless video games, the myth was now complete and almost entirely wrong. Generations of children grew up learning this false history. It became so embedded in our culture that questioning it seemed impossible. For decades, this lie stood largely unchallenged. How could it be? All we had were bones and artifacts. But then, in the 21st century, something extraordinary happened. Scientists developed a way to make the dead speak, and what they had to say would shatter everything we thought we knew about the Vikings. Here's what changed everything, and why this discovery is one of the most important archaeological breakthroughs in human history. For most of human history, the dead kept their secrets. When someone died, their story died with them. All we had were bones, artifacts, and educated guesses. Archaeologists would measure skulls, study burial goods, and try to piece together the past, but they were essentially working blind. That all changed with the discovery of DNA. But for decades, it was only useful for studying living things. Then, in the 1990s, scientists made a breakthrough. They realized that DNA could survive in ancient bones and teeth. A new field emerged, paleogenomics. But here's the challenge most people don't understand. DNA degrades over time. After 1,000 years, it's like trying to read a book that's been shredded, burned, and scattered to the wind. In ideal conditions, you might recover tiny fragments, maybe 0.1% of the original genetic material, sometimes much less. And contamination is everywhere. A single sneeze from a lab technician can ruin months of work. One tiny piece of modern DNA can overwhelm the ancient signal. It's an incredibly delicate process. Scientists work in sterile clean rooms, wearing full protective gear. Every tool is sterilized. Every surface is cleaned. Most attempts fail. You might get only one shot at reading the genetic story of someone who died a millennium ago. But when it works, it's like having a conversation with the dead. We can learn who their ancestors were, what they looked like, where they came from, what diseases they carried, even what they ate. For the first time in human history, we could test our assumptions about the past against actual evidence, and the results would be shocking. In 2020, this technology led to the biggest archaeological breakthrough in decades, but the story of how it happened is more dramatic than you might think. Picture this: 442 Vikings, all dead for 1,000 years, about to testify in the biggest court case in history. The man who would let them speak was Professor Eski Willerslev, one of the world's leading experts in ancient DNA. He had a crazy idea. What if we could gather Viking remains from across Europe and analyze them all together? What if we could create the first ever genetic census of the Viking world? The project would take years, cost millions, require collaboration between dozens of institutions across multiple countries. But in 2020, they did it. An international team of scientists sequenced the full genomes of 442 men, women, and children from Viking-age burial sites. These weren't just from Scandinavia. They were from everywhere Vikings had traveled, from Greenland to Ukraine, from Scotland to Poland. Some were buried in magnificent ships, others in simple graves. Some were clearly warriors, others were farmers, traders, or craftspeople. For the first time in history, we could test the myth against reality. We could let the Vikings speak for themselves, and what they had to say would destroy everything we thought we knew. The first myth to fall was the biggest one of all. But before I reveal what they found, you need to understand just how revolutionary this discovery was. Let me tell you about a Viking cemetery in Orkney, Scotland, that changed everything we thought we knew about identity, culture, and what it means to be Viking. The Orkney Islands are remote, harsh, and beautiful. For centuries, they were at the crossroads of the Viking world. When archaeologists excavated a Viking cemetery there, they found exactly what they expected. The individuals were buried with classic Viking swords and shields. These weren't crude copies. These were high-quality Viking weapons, jewelry, and tools. The burial customs were textbook Viking. These people had lived as Vikings, fought as Vikings, and been honored as Vikings in death. But when scientists analyzed their DNA, they discovered something that should have been impossible. Zero Scandinavian ancestry. Absolutely zero. They were genetically identical to the local Pictish people of Scotland, the indigenous population that had lived there for centuries before the Vikings arrived. The Picts were skilled warriors and craftspeople. They had their own rich culture, their own traditions, their own identity. But at some point, these Pictish people made a choice. They adopted Viking culture, Viking technology, Viking beliefs. This wasn't conquest. This wasn't replacement. This was cultural conversion. The study found similar examples everywhere, like an individual buried in Norway with full Viking honors, traditional Viking weapons, Viking burial goods, Viking rituals. His genetics? Entirely Sami, the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia who had lived there for thousands of years before the Vikings. The Sami had their own distinct culture, their own language, their own way of life. But this individual had chosen to become Viking. Example after example showed the same pattern. Viking wasn't a race you were born into. It was a culture you could join, a lifestyle you could choose, an identity you could earn. Think about it like this. Today, you can be genetically Chinese, but culturally American. You can be ethnically Nigerian, but culturally British. Identity is complex. The Vikings understood this 1,000 years ago. Being Viking was about what you did, not where you came from. But if that shocked you, wait until you hear what they found inside Scandinavia itself, because the homeland of the Vikings held the biggest surprise of all. We think of Vikings as leaving Scandinavia to conquer the world, raiders and traders spreading out across Europe, but the genetic map revealed something incredible. It was a two-way street, and what was coming back to Scandinavia would shock you. The skeletons inside Scandinavia, the Viking homeland itself, revealed shocking genetic diversity. There was significant gene flow from Southern Europe, the British Isles, and even Central Asia. How is that possible? The answer lies in understanding that the Vikings weren't just warriors. They were some of the greatest traders in human history. The Volga trade route connected Scandinavia to the Middle East. Viking merchants traveled thousands of miles, trading furs for silver, amber for spices. In Viking graves, archaeologists have found silk from China, silver from the Islamic world, and jewelry from Constantinople. But they weren't just trading goods. They were meeting people, falling in love, starting families. A Viking trader might marry a woman from the Byzantine Empire. Their children would be raised in Scandinavia, adding Eastern European DNA to the Viking gene pool. But there was a much darker reality that contributed to this genetic diversity: slavery. The Vikings were prolific slave raiders. They called their slaves thralls, and they brought them back from all over the world. Ireland, Scotland, England, France, Russia. Viking raiders captured people from everywhere they went. But here's what's crucial to understand. These people didn't just serve and disappear. They integrated into Scandinavian society. Some thralls gained their freedom. Others married into Viking families. Their children became full members of society. Over generations, their DNA spread throughout the Viking population. The genetic evidence shows this clearly. By the height of the Viking Age, Scandinavia was one of the most genetically diverse regions in Europe. Far from being isolated, Viking Age Scandinavia was a cosmopolitan melting pot, more diverse than most modern cities. The Vikings understood something that we've forgotten. Diversity is strength. It brings new ideas, new technologies, new opportunities. But sometimes, the DNA tells a single, incredibly specific story. And I'm about to tell you about one of the most dramatic discoveries in the entire study. A story that reads like a thriller novel. In Estonia, archaeologists discovered something extraordinary. 2 ships buried on a beach, filled with the bodies of 41 men, all killed in a violent battle around 750 AD. They were buried with high-status Swedish weapons, gold and silver. For years, historians believed it was a diplomatic mission gone wrong. But when the DNA results came back, they revealed a stunning secret. The 41 men were all closely related. Many were brothers, others were cousins. Their genetics traced back to a single region in Sweden. These weren't diplomats. This was a family raiding party. Relatives from the same town sailing together to raid the Baltic coast. They were ambushed and killed by locals, their bodies thrown into their ships and buried on the beach where they fell. It's a snapshot of a single Viking adventure, frozen in time. A family's tragedy, revealed by their DNA 1,000 years later. But the study revealed something even more surprising about what Vikings actually looked like. The iconic blonde hair, blue eyes, the Nordic look. Surely this part was real. The DNA analysis of 442 Viking skeletons revealed the truth. Brown hair was far more common among Vikings than blonde. The majority of Vikings had brown hair. Many had dark eyes. The blonde stereotype was the exception, not the rule. But the study revealed something even more fascinating. The Viking world wasn't one unified group. It was three separate populations. Vikings from what is now Denmark mainly raided and settled in England. Vikings from Sweden tended to go east into the Baltics, Poland, and down to Russia. And Vikings from Norway traveled to the North Atlantic, settling Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland. These groups were genetically distinct. The Viking Age was a story of three different peoples, all heading in different directions. But the DNA didn't just tell us about ancestry and appearance. It revealed something completely unexpected about Viking health that would change how we understand the entire medieval period. The most shocking discovery came from the Vikings' teeth. Scientists were able to extract and sequence ancient pathogens, diseases that had been dormant for 1,000 years. They found evidence of an early strain of smallpox, but here's what makes this discovery so significant. The Vikings weren't just raiders and traders, they were inadvertent biological weapons. As they traveled across Europe, they carried deadly diseases to populations that had never been exposed to them before. This gives us an entirely new perspective on the Viking Age. They didn't just change Europe through conquest and culture, they changed it through disease. Sound familiar? The COVID-19 pandemic showed us how quickly diseases can spread through connected populations. The Vikings were doing this 1,200 years ago. But what does all this mean for our understanding of history? And why were we told such a different story for so long? So the Viking DNA they tried to erase wasn't erased by warriors or time, it was erased by centuries of myth-making, nationalism, and propaganda. The real Viking story isn't one of racial purity, but of connection, migration, and a complex multicultural world. The blonde, blue-eyed stereotype is a ghosta political construct created by people who lived centuries after the Viking Age ended. The reality, written in the DNA of the Vikings themselves, is of a people far more diverse and far more interesting than we ever imagined. Viking identity was earned, not inherited. It was about what you did, not where you came from. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. In a world obsessed with genetic purity and racial division, the Vikings remind us that the most successful cultures have always been the most diverse. Science has given the Vikings their true history back, and in doing so, it's given us a more honest picture of who we really are. The history books are being rewritten by science. DNA is revealing secrets that have been hidden for centuries. What other historical myths should we investigate next? The pure bloodlines of European royalty? The origins of ancient civilizations? The truth about human migration? Tell us in the comments below what historical lie you want us to expose next. And if you want to uncover more secrets hidden in our DNA, hit that subscribe button because the truth is out there, waiting to be discovered.